Okay, I think we should maybe get started. We'll at least start with the intros while folks are filtering in. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for the second event in our 40 Years of Queer BIPOC Feminism series as part of our programming theme this year, dedicated to care for the future. I'm Maria Murphy, and I'm the Associate Director at the Center for Research in Feminist, Queer, and Transgender Studies here at Penn, and I would like to begin our event today with a land acknowledgement. In an effort to recognize both the historical and ongoing practices of colonization, we wish to affirm that the FQT Center and Program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at the University of Pennsylvania occupies the traditional, unceded lands of the Lenni Lenape. We wish to acknowledge the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together in this community that, while virtual today, is based out of Philadelphia. Our year at the center, dedicated to care work, is part of an ongoing effort to recognize and redress our own individual and institutional place in settler colonialism, and to better understand care work as necessarily informed by Indigenous epistemologies. We wish to express gratitude for the range of Indigenous knowledges that disrupt notions of ownership, not only concerning land and sovereignty, but also knowledges that inform fundamental understandings of interconnection and collective liberation. These are themes that might be particularly meaningful to think about during our event today, which seeks to pay homage to work predicated on collective modes of care and imagining more just possibilities for care in the future. In line with these efforts, we continue to work toward disrupting settler understandings of land and environment that rationalize claims to land as property. In particular, by working with Penn for Pilots, the staff and faculty group that is advocating for Penn as the largest private property owner in Philadelphia to participate in a payments in lieu of taxes program to pay their fair share to Philly's public schools. This is an issue we'd like to encourage the FQT-GSWS community to follow closely, especially in light of Penn's recent announcement to partner with and invest in Henry C. Lee Elementary School. Lee's students deserve a quality education, and so does every student in the city. Public schools are not charities, and their resources and policies shouldn't be set by private institutions giving targeted gifts. Penn can easily afford to meet its full obligation to the city and has the opportunity to put things right in this spring's city budget process by increasing its annual payment to $40 million every year, a full pilot payment to benefit the entire public school system. For more information on this campaign and how to get involved, please visit pennforpilots.org. We also encourage everyone in our community to check out resources and events from Natives at Penn and consider signing the petition for Penn to recognize Indigenous Peoples Day, which I'll share in the chat. Thank you. It's my pleasure now to turn this event over to our moderator, Deborah Thomas, who is the R. Jean Brownlee Professor of Anthropology and the Director at the Center for Experimental Ethnography here at Penn. She is also core faculty in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, holds a secondary appointment with the Graduate School of Education, and is a member of the graduate groups in English, Africana Studies, Comparative Literature, and the School of Social Policy and Practice. Clearly, from all of her affiliations, you can tell that Deb is a much sought after and beloved collaborator and co-conspirator on our campus. She is also the author of Modern Blackness, Nationalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Culture in Jamaica, and Exceptional Violence, Embodied Citizenship in Transnational Jamaica, among other books, articles, and volumes. She also co-produced and co-directed the experimental documentary 4 Days in May, co-curated the Bearing Witness exhibit, and co-directed the documentary Bad Friday, Rastafari After Coral Gardens. Prior to her life as an academic, she was a professional dancer with the New York-based Urban Bushwoman. Thank you so much, Deb. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. I like co-conspirator. That should be actually the main title, right, for all of us. It's so great to be here today with you all and to see some faces I haven't seen in a long time. Gloria, it's good to see you, since we're not really leaving our little pods these days. And I'm really excited to be in conversation with Rod Ferguson and Erica Edwards today. And so I'm going to introduce them. And then I will invite each of them to speak for a little bit about what they're currently thinking about. And then I have some questions for them, and then we'll open up to all of you. And you can put questions in the chat, or at some point you can raise whatever color your hand is on Zoom, and we will recognize you, and you can talk. Roderick Ferguson is the William Robertson Coe Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Professor of American Studies at Yale University. He received his BA from Howard University and his PhD from the University of California, San Diego. An interdisciplinary scholar, his work traverses American studies, gender studies, queer studies, cultural studies, African American studies, sociology, literature, and education. He is most recently the author of One Dimensional Queer. He also has contributed much to our intellectual grist for the mill, and I'll list a few. We Demand, the University and Student Protests, which was released by University of California in 2017, The Reorder of Things, Aberrations in Black, Toward a Queer of Color Critique, and he's the co-editor with Grace Hong of the anthology Strange Affinities, The Gender and Sexual Politics of Comparative Racialization. He is also co-editor with our other speaker today, Erica Edwards, and Jeffrey Ogbar of Keywords in African American Studies, which came out through NYU Press in 2018. Rod is currently working on 2 monographs in view of the tradition, art, and Black radicalism, and the Bookshop of Black Queer Diaspora. He is also the 2020 recipient of the Kessler Award from the Center for LGBTQ Studies. Erica Edwards is Associate Professor of English and the Presidential Term Chair in African American Literature at Rutgers University. She is an expert in African American literature, politics, and feminist studies, and she is the author of Charisma and the Fictions of Black Leadership, which was released in 2012. Most recently, and this is what we'll be talking about today, I imagine, though there are some continuities with her earlier work, as is always the case, she recently released a book called The Other Side of Terror, Black Women and the Culture of US Empire, and that was published last year by NYU Press. Erica, as I said, is the co-editor of Keywords for African American Studies, and her work has appeared in numerous journals, including Differences, Callaloo, American Quarterly, American Literary History, and Black Camera. Both Rod and Erica have consistently asked us to look again at how historical disavowals have led us to misapprehend the ways that masculinist and white supremacist hierarchies reproduce themselves. And also the ways that US empire and counterinsurgency campaigns become normalized, right? Both with respect to knowledge production and in relation to the imagination of what is possible. And I think their new books are no exception here in this regard. So what I'd like both of you to do is I'm going to invite you to talk briefly, either about those 2 books that I mentioned, or about what you're thinking about now, or what you're thinking those recently published works have pushed you to imagine in your future work. And then, as I said, after which I'll throw out some questions. So which of you would like to start?
I'm happy to start. Erica, is that okay? Okay, cool. All right. Well, my thanks to Maria Murphy and the other organizers. It's a pleasure to be here, to be in conversation with Deb Thomas and Erica Edwards. I'd like to use my time to talk about my own history with these texts as a young undergrad, as a grad student, as a beginning author and teacher, and now. I want to pay particular attention to what these texts have meant to me in terms of models for using writing to imagine alternative worlds and institutions. I can locate my own history with the two texts in terms of my undergraduate and graduate years. I'm pretty sure that I came to, but some of us are brave, as an undergraduate at Howard. That would make sense because it was at Howard that I first encountered feminism through classes, faculty, friends, and fellow students. It's where I was introduced to Paula Giddings's landmark text, When and Where I Enter, The Impact of Black Women on Race and Sex in America, Bell Hooks's Talking Back, Thinking Feminist, Thinking Black, the anniversary concerts for Sweet Honey in the Rock, and so on. Now, Howard is many things, but for me, it was a place where I encountered and was inspired by Black feminism. I encountered Brave, the anthology, in that context as a student, and it primed me for interrogations of power, the uses of difference, and liberatory agendas. I encountered this bridge while I was a grad student at UC San Diego, in the struggles for affirmative action, in the catastrophic state measures that abolished affirmative action in the state, that ended social services for immigrants and their families, and that expanded the prison industrial complex. The need for coalitions was abundantly clear because it was a moment in which multiple racial groups were literally being targeted. This bridge came into my life at a moment in which I needed it. It helped me think through coalitions and to do so in ways that were consistent with the kind of education that I had gotten around Black feminism at Howard. In other words, the book provided a way of theorizing the political urgencies of that time in terms of analyses of race, gender, sexuality, class, and so on. In my first book, you could say that I had the two books, at least the formations that they represent, in mind. I wanted to theorize queer of color critique as a formation that shared a project with both women of color feminism and Black feminism. Now, this is, of course, a coalition one sees in this bridge. Recall Toni Cade Bambara's foreword, in which she says, the moment that occasioned this bridge was filled with possibilities. Quote, the possibility of several million women refuting the numbers game inherent in minority, the possibility of denouncing the insulated, orchestrated conflict game of divide and conquer through the fashioning of potent networks of all the daughters of the ancient mother cultures is awesome, mighty, a glorious life work, end quote. It's also there when Gloria Hull, Patricia Bell Scott, and Barbara Smith write, quote, we hope that this one volume on Black women helps to create a climate where succeeding works on American Indian, Asian American, and Latino women can more swiftly come into being, end quote. There are texts in each book that I cannot do without as a teacher and as a scholar. Barbara Smith's Toward a Black Feminist Criticism was crucial to making an argument about the genealogy of queer of color critique and how that genealogy lies in Black and women of color feminisms. Recall, for instance, Smith's effort to establish lesbian as a political and cultural hermeneutic, one that could be a part of, as she put it, quote, a developed body of Black feminist political theory whose assumptions could be used in the study of Black women's art, end quote. The Combahee River Collective Statement has always been a profoundly inspirational and imitable text as I have tried to think the intersections of Marxism, queer sexuality, and Black feminism. I continue to be inspired as a teacher and as a writer by the ethical charge that Ansel Dua gives us in Speaking in Tongues, a letter to third world women writers. In that essay, she says, quote, why am I compelled to write? Because the writing compels me from the complacency I fear, because I have no choice, because I must keep the spirit of my revolt and myself alive, because the world I create in the writing compensates for what the real world does not give me. By writing, I put order in the world, give a handle so I can grasp it, end quote. I go back to these words when I need to remind myself that I do not and cannot write for the purposes of promotion, publicity, or awards, that lives are at stake in the critical and imaginative work that we do. Sherry Moraga's preface to this bridge and Grace Hong's reading of it have become a unit in my mind. In her introduction to The Ruptures of American Capital, Women of Color Feminism, and the Culture of Immigrant Labor, Hong writes of the bus ride through Roxbury that Moraga described, stating, quote, Moraga's preface focuses on Boston to identify the ways the reorganization of cities and economies under globalization leads to an increase in the repressive role of the nation state in the form of police surveillance and the displacement of impoverished, racialized communities. Moraga's preface articulates the need for more complex, intersectional analytics that might understand segregation, suburbanization, and police violence, not only as signals of the fundamental contradictions of the nation state, but as inherent to capital's global phase, end quote. Here, Hong turns our attention to the traces of globalization that are inscribed in local and national terrains. In Gloria Hull and Barbara Smith's introduction entitled The Politics of Black Women's Studies, they tell the story of an enslaved Black woman, Milla Granson, who taught other slaves to read in her midnight school. The account of Granson's midnight school says, quote, her number of scholars was 12 at a time, and when she had taught these to read and write, she dismissed them, and again took her apostolic number and brought them up to the extent of her ability, until she had graduated hundreds. A number of them wrote their own passes and started for Canada, end quote. As Hull and Smith say in their reflections, quote, this document illuminates much about Black women educators and thinkers in America. Milla Granson used her skills not to advance her own status, but to help her fellow slaves, and this under the most difficult circumstances, end quote. This passage and Hull and Smith's assessment illuminates a thread that runs through both books. Black feminism and women of color feminism are means of imagining alternative communities and fashioning liberations and using whatever is at hand for that endeavor. The archival entry, the poem, the essay, the short story, the novel, the bibliography, the memoir, the letter, and so on. Everything is material in that enterprise. Lastly, events like this are important because they allow us to reactivate texts whose wisdom might otherwise be lost, texts like the one about Milla Granson's Midnight School. We've been talking about the contributors to the volumes through their identities as writers, but there's a great deal to be learned about the specific ways in which they were readers, how they refused to let the discarded text stay so, how they insisted that texts by women of color still contained midwifery properties, even when others claimed they could and should be retired. About reading, Roland Barthes said something that is applicable to this bridge and to Brave. He said, to read is to find meanings, and to find meanings is to name them. But these named meanings are swept toward other names. Names call to each other, reassemble, and their grouping calls for further naming. I name, I unname, I rename, so the text passes. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Rod. Thank you to the Center for Research in Feminist, Queer, and Transgender Studies. It's a real honor to be part of this series with so many people who I've been in such rich conversation with, including Rod. So I'm going to share my screen just for a few moments. The first thing you see when you open But Some of Us Are Brave is Tia Cross's 1979 photograph of women marching in Boston to call attention to the serial murder of Black women. the serial, obsessive, violent disregard for the lives of Black and so-called third world women. Their banner reads, "Third world women, we cannot live without our lives." You may have seen this banner before, as it often appears in photographs of actions of the Combahee River Collective in the 1980s. The tone of this photograph is mournful, but also resolute. The marchers' heads are down, their eyes are squinting or downcast. Only one marcher looks directly at the photographer. The rest watch their steps, their mouths closed, their brows furrowed, their hands clutching the banner whose message has become all too real, too heavy, possibly too much to bear. With the background of the photo carefully removed, the harsh, unfeeling neoliberal city cropped out, what we see is the quiet activity of holding, walking, mourning, carrying the banner for the dead. In 1979, the Combahee River Collective published a pamphlet on self-defense called "6 Black Women, Why Did They Die?" Because they were responding to the serial murder of Black women in Roxbury, and because they were writing in the face of police indifference and media lies, as they wrote, they had to keep crossing out the number of victims. So 6 became 7, then 8, and 11. The pamphlet issued tips for self-protection, like get to know your neighbors on your street, or make an effort. And it listed places where readers could go to organize, to seek shelter and to get counseling, to care for themselves and to care for each other. So I wanted to begin here because the photograph that serves as our sort of vestibule between the world and Black women's studies in BRAVE is an image of what the organizers of today's event signal as a testament to the centrality of care in foundational queer feminist writing. In my comments, and I'll stop my share now, I want to provide some thoughts on the historical context for But Some of Us Are Brave, published in 1982, and This Bridge Called My Back, published the year before. One of the things that inspires me when I return to these two collections is how, especially when we consider them examples of a kind of print or literary activism that involved not only published books, but also Xeroxed pamphlets and benefit readings, they give evidence to the active cultivation of internationalist Black feminism and women of color feminism, a sort of radical women of color feminism, at a moment when we generally think of radicalism in decline. So if we think of the 1960s as a sort of apex of what has been called the second Reconstruction, the height of the Black post-war Black freedom struggle, the 2 decades that followed could arguably be called a second nadir for that, radical restructuring. The 20 years after 1968 saw the state escalate its repression of radicalism through the mushrooming death industries of policing, incarceration, intelligence, foreign policy, and security. At the same time, the shift from protest to institutional politics, embraced by liberals and leftists alike, meant that the more radical challenges of social movement activists would often be bracketed in favor of more liberal, politically efficient goals. Incorporation came with inevitable compromises and losses. So we might say, following Rod's essential work in the reorder of things, that the social movements of the 1960s didn't occasion the end of power, but rather occasioned its new beginning. To quote Rod in that book, affirmation and regulation would become bound up with one another like never before during these years, sort of producing minority difference as the site of a new contradiction that straddled valorization and devaluation, change and status quo. Of course, incorporation was only one mode of containing BIPOC radicalism. Surveillance, incarceration, and police violence were also key in criminalizing and discrediting the freedom struggle. The state was quite comprehensive in its aim to code especially Black freedom making as lawless and to criminalize legitimate grievances against the state. The arrests, raids, assassinations, and torture campaigns targeting BIPOC radicals in the late 1960s and early 1970s systematically thwarted post-civil rights radicalism. But this narrative of retrenchment and co-optation, a narrative perhaps too closely focused on what June Jordan called the whispering misery of the 1970s, disappears the unstoppable force of radical Black feminist and women of color activism, which surfaced in organized collectives such as the Combahee or the Black Women's Revolutionary Council in Oakland or the Third World Women's Alliance, as well as in looser, more ephemeral collectivities gathered in protest against nuclear proliferation, South African apartheid, and the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip well into the 1980s. Even more importantly for us, the narrative of post-civil rights defeat and retreat downplays the organized, productive rupture that BIPOC feminists forged in print culture in the late 1970s and early 80s. Written in the 1980s, then, in the aftermath of the 1960s anti-colonial movements and the repression that followed, repression that appeared sometimes as invitations to a seat at the table, other times as violent exclusion, this bridge and Brave pierce both the narrative of post-1960s defeat and the claims of post-civil rights, what will eventually become post-racial progress. Both texts affect this double refusal of both defeat and progress by carefully negotiating the commitment to radicalism and the demands of legitimacy. Consider the tightrope that Hull, Scott, and Smith walk in their introduction to Brave, where they censure William Faulkner for referring to the quote, vacuous idiocy of his Black woman characters' idle and illiterate kind. But instead of demanding a broader, more inclusive canon of American literature, the editor suggests the urgency of, quote, autonomously defined investigations of self. Autonomously defined investigations, which must place disciplinary methods like close reading in tension with materialist studies of Black women's lives. They call for courses on intraracial sexual violence, on radical Black feminist economics, on abolition, on the social history of Black women's domestic work, and on the investigation of Black women's mental and physical health in a society whose final solution for us and our children, they write, is death. So we could say there's an almost utopian tendency towards comprehensive coverage of Black women that refuses the easy inclusionist efforts of what will become diversity pedagogy and canon reform. The syllabus for Barbara Smith's fall 1973 Black women writers class at Emerson College included in Brave, along with a number of amazing syllabi, includes a film screening, a talk and demonstration on the history of Black women in music, and an interdisciplinary panel discussion featuring experts who can speak to the breadth of Black women's lives in its social, economic, psychological, and political dimensions. So what strikes me about Brave, what stays with me and draws me back repeatedly, is its archiving and collecting, what Rod referred to as its tendency to use whatever is at hand to document a growing base for Black women's studies. What I treasure about this bridge, I think, is the urgency of its relational politics and its interdisciplinary weaving of creative and critical texts. and the urgency of placing under duress sisterhood as an organizing category. I think of the poet and now legal scholar Joe Carrillo's poem, "And When You Leave, Take Your Pictures With You," where she writes, "Our white sisters, radical friends, love to own pictures of us sitting at a factory machine, wielding a machete in our bright bandanas, holding brown, yellow, black, red children, holding machine guns, bayonets, bombs, knives. Our white sisters, radical friends, should think again." Carrillo ends the poem, "We are not as happy as we look on their wall." The poem is again a sort of strident refusal of inclusion on the terms of the established order of women's rights and women's studies. I think too of Audre Lorde's letter to white poet Mary Daly, where she asks, "Mary, do you ever really read the work of Black women? Did you ever read my words, or did you merely finger through them for quotations which you thought might valuably support an already conceived idea concerning some old distorted connection between us?" Written in what Lorde referred to as the wild and bloody spring of 1979, that same summer of the serial murders in Boston, the letter was a response to Daly's 1978 book, Gynecology, The Meta-Ethics of Radical Feminism, a book that Lorde charged with only including non-European women as victims and predators. The letter from Lorde, collected in this bridge, reads as a refusal of the gift of the book, a refusal that stands in the space of misogynoir and forces readers to grapple with the motives they bring to the pictures and texts and activist labor and care labor of Black, Indigenous, Latina, Asian American, and Arab women. These are books about study as a live field, set free from high school and college classrooms. But also, these are books about crafting the most radical inhabitation possible in the classrooms of late capitalist ruin. They continue to teach me about the urgency of relation and the poetics of possibility in this here place. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, both of you. Oh, sorry, I'm just, the Zoom messages coming through. Thank you so much, both of you. I want to sort of, pick up on something both of you said. I mean, I think what's so, I think we can all remember the first time we picked up this bridge or we picked up Brave, and the things that the essays or the contributions to those volumes that spoke to us, and that different contributions speak to us differently at different moments. And, it makes me think about anthologizing as a practice. And this is something Jafari Allen has been thinking a lot about recently, but I want to ask you, because you both sort of go back to this this moment of collectivities and radical and diversely radical collectivities and the way that they become erased. You both talked about it just now, and you both have been doing that kind of work in your own books. And I want to ask you a question about anthologies and the moment, right? You mentioned this a bit, Erica, when you're situating them in the early 80s, right? Late 70s, early 80s, a moment that we would not usually associate with the kind of radical voice, right? But, it's the moment and the place are so important to the building of these collectivities. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about what is lost in today's moment and today's spaces in which, or if you see something about today's moment and today's spaces bringing collectivities back into being? Or are we just being nostalgic, for this earlier moment? I often just associate California, certainly with this bridge, because I also first encountered it in California. But I'd love to hear you think about space, time, anthologizing, and collectivity building.
Erica, do you want to go first as the sort of lead editor for the anthology that we did?
I can, although I wasn't thinking about that connection. I mean, it's interesting to think of in particular, like the Black feminist or woman of color feminist anthology as a sort of world-making project, as a sort of self-conscious intervention in a kind of, discourse on feminism, but also in a discourse on radicalism. Both of these seem to me to be conscious attempts at, kind of defining a field of activism and knowledge production, and also building a tradition or genealogy, right? And this is particularly true of Brave, right? Where, claiming the field of Black women's studies means finding unlikely, sort of progenitors, right? Like grandson teaching her midnight school, or like all the pictures of women at Tuskegee that are in the book, right? So trying to sort of fabricate a genealogy where it doesn't seem like one might exist is part of the work of anthology. So the anthology becomes an enactment of a sort of stubborn collectivity in the making. There was something else I was going to say, but I forgot what it was. But yeah, but what's interesting about this world making project, and I think this sort of goes to your question, Deb, is it also imagines itself as a kind of geographic practice, a kind of remapping of the world, a project of declaring solidarities where they are not presumed to exist, and across spaces that aren't intended to be linked, except through like counterinsurgency discourse, right? So making other claims to connections than those that are sort of publicly available. I don't know yet what to say about how that relates to the sort of collectivity making that we see today. But I do think that we might count the renewed and the sort of serious attention being paid to texts like this, even in this moment, as indicative of something more than nostalgia, something in excess of nostalgia. Or even if we consider it as nostalgia, we might consider that nostalgia has its uses too, right? That what the anthology as a form aims to do is, gather whatever's at hand, like Rod said, as a way of gathering in whosoever might come to the text, right? And presuming that people will come to the text with all kinds of, motives, and there are all kinds of reasons why one might pick up a book on someone else's coffee table, but trusting that, one of these, 40 documents contained between these covers might sort of draw someone who wouldn't otherwise be engaged in struggle into a sort of radical resistance. So that's sort of what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, I kind of am nostalgic for those anthologies and the moments in which they were made, right? Because they're very different from the moments that we have now. I mean, you're talking about, there was no sort of really institutionalized in the Academy of Women of Color Feminism. It certainly wasn't a Black women's study. So, it's in the moment of like their nascency, one, and also two, you could point to the various social movements and organizations that contributors were a part of, right? And you could see the making of the anthologies as part of movement efforts. So that, like, Kitchen Table Women of Color Press, that was a movement organ, it wasn't like University of Minnesota or Duke or, NYU or UC Press. And so, part of what's interesting about the question for me is like, so how do we get back or get some elements of that moment, right? Which also means, what do we do with the ethos of the academic and administrative ethos that we currently produce those anthologies in? Like, it's a very different experience to do keywords of African American studies than, say, when these contributors and these editors were putting together these particular texts. I remember when Grace Hong and I were working on Strange Affinities, and there was a moment where we brought everybody, all the contributors, for a weekend at UCLA to talk about the anthology, their pieces, but also what was at stake, in terms of where conversations are in the university, the American university, but also what's going on politically. And just in that moment, that weekend, it felt like there was a touch of what I imagine folks experienced regularly in the making of Brave and This Bridge.
Yeah, regularly and also precariously, I think, on some level, and I mean, partly I asked because you both in different ways go back to some of these moments, right? So, and you're showing us in your own work how radical visions and radical coalition building and sort of communities working across facile, boundaries become disciplined into something that can fit into a kind of liberal compact. And you show us specifically about how the erasure of Black bodies and other people of color and queer of color bodies is actually necessary for this disciplining, right? Which is the moment of 1989 forward, right? That constant sort of pummeling and erasure. And the cultivation of other kinds of leadership, other kinds of patterns of recognition or patterns of inclusion that keep the radical vision out, but demonstrate some, what Erica calls, empire through this kind of co-optation of Black achievement, right? And representation of Blackness within leadership, within the military, within popular culture, all of the things that they would not have had, right, in that moment that you're talking about. So I wonder if you could take some time to imagine out loud, this moment and the undoing, the potential undoing. Like, in what ways can the illumination that you all do of these moments, these collectivities, unsettle the orders that we're currently living with, and I'm, I think about people like Kara Keeling or James Sneed, also Denise Ferreira da Silva, how does Blackness and how does queer of color critique undo our current configurations, and also, what would have had to have happened for these kind of coalitional and multidimensional understandings of radical queer politics to have become canonical broadly. They're canonical to us but to have become canonical broadly and, the foundation for, anti-imperialist organizing, today. What are the configurations in which this work can continue to undo the formations with which we're constantly contending?
Mhm.
Do you want to go first this time, Rod?
Okay. I was going to say, Erica, you want to talk about your book? Well, I mean, I think, here's a lesson to learn from, just that passage in which Gloria Hull and Barbara Smith, talk about the entry, on Miller Granson, that they get from Gerda Lerner's Black Women in White America, where, it's like, okay, like for instance, today I'm teaching a queer and trans liberation course, for the semester. And today we were focusing on an interview from 1971 done with Marsha P. Johnson about street transvestite action revolutionaries. And, it begins, as one would expect, right, about how the police, are apprehending members of STAR after they have written a piece about the work that they do, I should say, as activists in STAR, but also as sex workers in the Village Voice. They name themselves, and then shortly after that, each one of them is rounded up, by the police. And I coupled that reading with a conversation between Dean Spade, Eric Stanley, and also the group Queering Injustice about, and I think the interview is titled Queering Abolition Now, about what does it mean to think about abolitionist politics in terms of the genealogies of queer and trans folks. Now, I did that so that students would get that bit of history, right? But that they would also think about abolitionist politics now, and what do we do, for instance, with what Marsha P. Johnson describes as the police having absolute authority to apprehend lives and bodies, and also the recent No Knock murder that happened in the Twin Cities of Minnesota, where the police have a no-knock warrant. They go into someone's house. There's a guest in the house sleeping on the sofa. He's startled, he sees the police, he reaches for a gun, they shoot him, And in other words, to sort of illustrate for the students how these archival texts, aren't dusty at all. Like, they actually, provide us with material for understanding our now. So I think that for me is one way to get at, what you're talking about, Deb, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really insightful. I kind of want to think for a moment about one of the questions you posed, Deb, in that lovely matrix of questions that you just posed, which was about thinking in the first place about how these works came to be canonical. And I think it's worth noting that the way that these texts became so well known to us has to do with a sort of coming together of work that happened sort of unapologetically within institutions like ours. So I think about how hard my late colleague Cheryl Wall worked to make sure that, African American literature was understood as a literary tradition in our department, which meant really calling upon the sort of normative language of literary discourse to make a case for teaching classes about, say, getting classes like Black women's writing on the books, right? So a coming together of kind of like work within institutions and partnerships with collectives outside of institutions like ours, this, double commitment to absolutely institutionalizing Black feminist studies, women of color feminist studies on campuses, and at the same time, a commitment to sort of, exploding these institutions from within. I think that's something that really strikes me as important to note. I mean, Brave begins at like an MLA committee meeting, right? So it's important to note that, right? And it's also important to think about the conditions under which these texts stay in circulation and continue to be reprinted. At the same time, I think it's hard to ignore the fact that over and over again, we'll see the writers collected here really questioning the value of this work, right? Like in her preface to this bridge, Shuri Moraga asks the question, cara a cara con el enemigo, que valen mis palabras, which is to say, face to face with the enemy, what value do my words have? Or she says, sometimes this feels like dumping your words into a very dark hole. And I think this sense of pessimism deepens by the time we get to the 1983 second edition, when we're in the midst of the Reagan administration's assault on the whole hemisphere, right? Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Chile, Grenada, right? To say nothing of South African apartheid or the bombings in Lebanon or Philippines, right? So I think it's important to recognize that the kind of limits that we might feel that as palpable, the limits of sort of textual activism or university activism are also sort of built into what we see as these sort of canonical inspirational texts. I think the question of like what is necessary or what it would take to create useful, mobile collectives in the present. To answer that question, I really just return to this work, but I also return to both of your work. I think about the really important point that Deb, you make in your most recent book about bearing witness or cultivating what Avery Gordon refers to as response ability, like the actual capacity to respond to violent, gratuitous violence in parts of the world that may not feel like our world, right? Is also really important as a basis for, drawing people together. So I think about bearing witness, and I also return to like refusal, like the refusal of progress as an important kind of modality.
There was a part that I wanted to read right quick from the introduction to Brave that gets at, it's the first part of what Eric was talking about in terms of the kind of contradictory location of these texts and their production. So Hull and Barbara Smith say, women's studies began as a radical response to feminist realization that knowledge of ourselves has been deliberately kept from us by institutions of patriarchal learning. Unfortunately, as women's studies has become both more institutionalized and at the same time more precarious within traditional academic structures, the radical, life-changing vision of what women's studies can accomplish has constantly been diminished in exchange for acceptance, respectability, and the career advancement of individuals. I mean, so something like that is really powerful, I think, because it, you know, they saw also the pitfalls of the very institutions that they hailed and needed at that moment, right? And so, you know, I mean, you can imagine that, okay, walking in the terrain, knowing that you need to walk in that direction, but also knowing that there are dangers, you know, in the path that you need, right? And so it seems to me that that kind of double vision, you know, to say, okay, I need to go there, but also there is dangerous, you know, it's something like holding those two things in awareness at the same time is something that we can learn from these folks.
I mean, in a way, it kind of explodes the binary between abolition and reform, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Reform that
Yeah.
are sometimes pitted against each other today.
Yeah,
About change. Yeah, I mean, you know, I wanted to think a minute about genealogical inheritance, I guess. And I'm co-teaching a class this semester called Citing Black Girlhood. And the objective is to bring together Philadelphia, Jamaica, and South Africa, and to think about Black girlhood across these spaces vis-a-vis a kind of shifting center within an imperial paradigm. And to see, you know, what are the convergences, what are the divergences, and to also use the class as a kind of vehicle for the travel of an exhibit that was done by Vashti Dubois at the Colored Girls Museum called The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face, which is a sort of portraiture exhibit of artists choosing a young muse and sort of documenting not just the girl, but also the process of understanding and really seeing the girl. And what does it mean to feel seen? What does it mean to look? You know, all of those kinds of things. I say that all as background just to say that this week we read Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. And many of them in their responses to that book called on, you know, we were talking about method, obviously, critical fabulation. What kinds of archives do we have? What do you do with these archives? How do you read in between, around, through, and what do you come up with, you know, at the end of that? And, you know, many of them then brought up the Venus in Two Acts essay. And it was interesting because I was thinking about it and we talked about it in class that, well, that essay actually was a paper that she gave at a conference that was organized in honor of the 20th or 25th, I don't remember now, anniversary of the publication of Hazel Carby's book, Reconstructing Black Womanhood, right? And you know, what I was thinking was, you know, there are these generational, moment-based desires for a kind of knowledge we don't have, you know, a kind of visibility and presence that we don't have. And so one generation of scholars, of activists, of people who straddle many of those spaces, you know, comes up with an archive and can put forward an archive that helps bring that desire into the world, right? That desire to see ourselves in a different way. And then a next generation, with Sai as Hazel Carby's student, you know, the next generation needs to find something else to do with those desires and those archives, you know. That generation provides a kind of groundation, you know, for us to then think again about, well, what else do we need? You know, what we can't tell the same stories in those ways. You know, how else do we need to imagine a mode or a method or a kind of spirit of narrating ourselves into visibility, you know, and into these spaces. So I wanted to ask you, you know, in terms of the archive that these two texts give us, and, you know, thinking then about two generations almost, you know, of work that has followed, you know, in what ways have later scholars, activists, organizers built on, shut down, imagined new approaches to the archives that we were given by these texts. You know, I mean, not for nothing, and you mentioned this, Erica, or the syllabi, you know, so now we have courses, you know, we change our syllabi, but we have courses, we have ways that we teach this. It is institutionally recognized and valuable in some way, you know. So anyway, I'd like to hear what you think, thinking forward generationally, genealogically, about what new approaches to these archives are possible or desirable.
Okay, you go first, Erica, this time.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about the way that both of these function as these sort of open-ended, you know, archival practices, right? As much as they are books between covers, they're also these sort of vibrant archival exercises, right? Like the collection of photographs in Brave, the way that the collection of syllabi, also the way that Bridge is so willing to gather up so many different kinds of media, like the letter from Audre Lorde, or the poem, or the short story, or the essay, right? And thinking about the way that not only, I do want to think about your question, Deb, the way that like the generations that sort of inherit these texts think about their relationship to those same archives or to sort of similar archives from the moment. But I also want to think about part of what makes me sort of return to these texts and texts like, you know, these, but also Toni K. Bambara's anthology, The Black Woman, is that I feel like often, because we think we already know these texts, we come to them with a sense that we already know what we're going to say, what they're going to say before we even sort of read them, right? And it reminds me of Lord's kind of rejoinder to Mary Daly, like, are you actually reading what I wrote? Are you just fingering through, right, to find quotations in support of what you've already decided your relationship with me is? And I think that my work sometimes as a teacher of these texts is to make them harder before making the move to, you know, kind of move forward and think about, you know, how they form the basis of our progress, right? So there's that sort of sticking with me, that sort of refusal to sort of finger through. And I think in that vein, I think a lot about the sort of deep archival engagement in an experimental text like Alexis Gumbs's Spill, where the work is really about not only close reading, you know, the works of Black feminists like Hortense Spillers, but also all of the writers that Gumbs is responding to, but crafting whole stories about characters or moments that we sometimes just pass over or think that we know really well, right? So I think thinking about these sort of innovative archival practices that work their way into contemporary texts, I think is really useful. There was one other thing I wanted to say, but I'll come back to it when it comes back to me.
All right, well, I would say that, I mean, my sense is that, you know, our archival work and assignments, they're nowhere near done, you know, that we have only skimmed the surface. You know, just a few examples. So, you know, when I discovered the missing chapter to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, you know, that got published in Aberrations, you know, I remember thinking at that moment, okay, so how do I want to present this text? Do I want to say, all right, here's a missing chapter from Invisible Man. and noted for its visibility, that it makes a Black queer character visible in this canonical African-American novel, right? Or do I want to use that archival discovery for its kind of hermeneutical levers, to make a claim about, look, this is what sociology has done. This is how it has also intersected with canonical literature in the production of racialized gender, racialized sexuality, right? And I decided on the latter, because I think for me, the archival discovery is necessary, right? Because there's a lot that's lost, that we don't know. But then once we get it, what's really important is asking how the text speaks to certain configurations of power, so that it's not about a visibility project in that moment, but what's going on now that this archival document can help us figure out. So another example is in the last book, in One Dimensional Queer, that anthology of Starr's writings and interviews that the writer Ain't Nothing put together, where Silva Rivera says, it wasn't that, we were these apolitical trans sex workers. We were all working in various movements, and she names the movements, right? Like that's a significant archival moment for me, and also a moment in terms of power knowledge, because she is actually shifting the discourse around the emergence of gay liberation. It wasn't a single issue effort at all, according to her. She says we all were in various movements of some type, and she says that's what led to Stonewall, right? So it's still important to do the kind of archival hunting, but to do it for the purposes of understanding power at this moment, And also we have to say that like things get lost all the time. I just learned that Essex Hempfield's ceremonies is out of print. So the things that we think have a steady place in the archive can drop out very easily, especially when you're talking about works by people of color, women of color,
That's right.
queers of color.
Yeah, I don't think that the archival work is done, but I think that our desires around it shift, and then the way we imagine that archives can be mobilized also can change. But I've been in so many meetings or gatherings where people say, oh, we should publish something with essays and syllabi and such and da da da. I'm like, right, like as happened in the 80s, as like an innovative kind of compilation, which of course it would be, but it's a continuation of a practice that was started in this other radical moment.
Yeah. And I think in those conversations, if we were really to activate the spirit of these anthologies, we would also ask, and what's the political vision project that this is a part of,
Yeah. And what are the sponsoring organizations?
Yeah, totally right.
He is working in some kind of organizational sphere.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Erica, did you remember what you forgot?
Yeah, no, it was just, I wanted to mention that I was thinking about, as you were asking about the archival work that these texts do and the kind of archival work that we sort of see around us now. And I was thinking about, as Rod was talking about the sort of self-conscious archiving that Black feminists and women of color feminists knew they had to do in the 80s, like in the early 80s, like I'm thinking about, you know, famously Alice Walker writing in Search of Our Mother's Gardens about how important it is to, you know, kind of fabulate or fabricate a whole genealogy of artists that she retrieves from, you know, sort of Black women's care work, like cooking or weaving or sewing, right? So to think about that work as art, as a way of clearing a path through sort of genealogy making for contemporary Black women's art practice. And so I think it's perhaps important for us to think about, you know, sort of previous texts in that way as part of our own sort of, you know, work of fabulation. But it's also, I think, important to resist the urge to see, you know, 1970s and 1980s texts as, you know, so historical that they aren't sort of alive anymore, right? Or that they aren't actually talking about the organization of power that we're still living under, right? So part of what brings me to the text of this particular moment, like 1979, is that they are speaking to a shift in power whose effects are really now as more powerfully felt than perhaps they were in that moment, right? So there's a tendency to call these works sort of prescient, but I think instead of calling them prescient, we might just see them as really attentive to the shifting nature of power in the late 1970s, early 1980s moment. So if we see 1970s, early 1980s Black and women of color feminists as theorists of power and read them as closely as we read other theorists of power, I think that's an important part of our archival practice.
Yeah, that's
Here.
appreciate that. Yeah. So I want to make sure other people can come into this conversation. So I'd like to open it up for people to ask questions. I only see 6 of you at the top of my screen. So if you have a question, maybe you could go down to the bottom of your screen where it says reactions and then raise hand. Ah, great, perfect. Melissa, would you go ahead, please?
Yes, hi, thank you, all 3 of you really so much for both those thoughtful, amazing presentations and that discussion. I was so interested in all of the discussion of, you know, I think what you call the genealogical inheritance, and you know what you were just saying about the idea of reading this work as theories of power or an archival practice that thinks about this work as theories of power, especially when within its own context. So I was teaching this bridge a few weeks ago, and I'm always struck by the intro to the 2nd edition, The Refugees of a World on Fire. And you read that list, you know, which, you know, of all of the terrible things that are going on and, you know, that have happened between 1982 and, you know, a couple of years later when the 2nd volume or the 2nd edition's coming out. And I read that and I guess thinking about these in terms of theories of power, theories of genealogy, also, you know, as you were saying, Rod, and as so much of your work has shown us, thinking about theories of these as theories of institutionalization. I guess, you know, this isn't, I guess what I'm trying to work through is in looking back at this work, I feel like we're not only refusing, Erica, what you described, if I wrote it down correctly, this refusal of both defeat and progress. And I feel like in the act of reading these and returning to this work and refusing to let it be forgotten, we're also participating in such a refusal of both defeat and progress. So I'm not sure how to exactly what I'm asking, but I'm trying to think about connections between that historical moment and this historical moment. And, you know, I can't even open the paper without wanting to hide under my bed these days. And I guess I'm wondering, like, what can we, reading this now, looking at them writing at an equally perhaps bleak moment, what kind of effective politics or idea of, you know, what is the use of this kind of theorizing or this kind of going back to the archives to us in our current historical situation? If that, in terms of reading these writers writing at what was an equally horrible historical situation. I'm sorry, I'm rambling and I'm not sure if that exactly makes sense, but so many light bulbs went off for me as you were both talking.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the kind of the affective response that I have, that I walk away from these texts with, is difficulty, right? I think I'm sort of thinking about that moment in the intro to Brave where the editors are noting just how difficult it was to pull these pieces together. Like, they're asking the question, why was it so hard just to get the Black colleague to send us their syllabus? Or why was it so hard for us to have one simple editorial meeting? I think about the difficulty of pursuing this work in a world that normalizes, you know, the death of Black women. Also thinking about how difficult the kind of, you know, coalitional work that we admire in Bridge. I think it's important to recognize how difficult it was and how many sort of relationships were broken because of these sort of failures to be able to communicate across differences. So if we recognize dissensus and silence and difficulty as kind of palpable parts of these projects, I think it's important for us to recognize our, you know, this sort of sticky, difficult places of failure in our own kind of organizing or, you know, teaching or institutional activism, as also just as part of it, as part of what, you know, constitutes the work that we do. So I think that one of the things that I kind of hold on to with these texts, and that, you know, all the texts and the social life around them, is just the sort of difficulty of it all, right? And the sort of stubbornness of the sort of stubborn determination of these writers and editors.
Yeah, you know, when I started working on the Bookshop of Black Queer Diaspora, which was around 2013, you know, I started that project because I wanted to address the emergence of neoliberalism in the UK and North America, so US and Canada, in the period of the 70s and 80s. And I wanted to show how Black I want to show how Black queer artists and activists responded to neoliberal formations in those states. What impressed me once I dug into it was how, and it was at this exhibition, This Will Have Been, the art exhibition about 1980s art. And I remember walking into one of the video rooms where it was just a series of Polaroids taken from the 1980s of, you know, mostly queer folks and queer and trans folks, you know, doing activism or having sex or going to work or being beat up or, you know, just all these constant images. I forget who the artist was who did it, but I remember coming out of that and saying, I really miss the fucked up 80s. And what I meant by that was that even in the midst of Reagan and all of the horrors that Reagan unleashed, people still found a reason to get up in the morning and do the activism and do the art. And so that started to feed questions of all my projects, really, as a teacher in the classroom, as a writer. And so I'm really clear that now, like with this queer and trans course, I want to give students models of people who still get up in the morning. You know, and like one of the students, or several of the students actually, were commenting on what Marsha P. Johnson was saying in this interview, that there was almost a kind of, there was a routineness to the police harassment and police violence, but then there was also this developed routine from the members of STAR to go on with their activism. You know, like it's important for me as a teacher to give students that, but also for me as a scholar to try and figure out, yeah, how do you get up in the morning when the shit is hitting the fan?
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. Like when I started working on this book on Black women and you know, US empire, I wanted to really think with the Black women writers who were living through the onset of neoliberalism and writing through it and seeing writing as a way to like save their own lives, you know, literally. And thinking about those for whom writing was this really urgent mission of, you know, saving the world from the psychopaths, as Toni K. Bambara said. And I was thinking about this moment that I write about when Bambara is, you know, she sort of has this assignment to write a review of June Jordan's collection of essays published in 1981, Civil Wars, but she's actively involved in a search for missing children in the midst of the Atlanta child murders. So she's walking through Atlanta with Civil Wars in her pocket and talking about how urgent it was for her, how necessary it was for her to have June Jordan's words with her, you know, that her words sort of served the purpose of allowing Bambara to, you know, get up another day and continue searching for missing children, right? So like thinking about this textual activism as, you know, more than a notion, right? More than just, you know, circulating words, but really enlisting that circulation in, you know, actively surviving and sort of changing the world.
Yeah, and I think that if I could just add that, you know, we can't underestimate actually how we do need models for that. You know, you think about Marlon Riggs in Black Is Black Ain't, where he is literally on his sickbed, you know, trying to continue with that film, right? I am convinced, without being able to verify it, that, if so many of those folks were influenced by the Audre Lordes, by the Barbara Smiths, by texts like this, you have to draw on models that, teach you how to carry on for another day, But it also means that we have to produce those models too, like that's also our job in this moment, not just to sort of be the recipient, but also to be the producer for the folks that are watching us.
Right. Right.
Thanks for that, both of you. Does anybody else, maybe okay, Gloria.
Gloria has a question.
Hi, everyone. I feel very interpellated by all the riches of your introductions and what you have been saying, and want to thank you for that, and also for the several references that of books I will want to read. So I would like to add my perspective from Black European place setting. And I can truly say that without those books, there wouldn't have been anything like Black feminism. Mm-hmm. For instance, in the Netherlands, where I am, that has opened so many of my peers' eyes in the 80s. And it would be very important, I think, to make parallel studies of what those texts did in the US and what they did in Europe, because I'm pretty sure the same was the case in the UK and in several other places. And so there is so much to say, which I can't right now, but I really think it's important to see like what different routes have been taken with those books and what they have accomplished in different places here in Europe. And for me personally, it's very important to see how that thinking, all the different themes that were such a place of recognition and being able to give ourselves a subjectivity as Black European women, which was lacking, that cannot be overestimated, really. So I wanted to underline that.
No, and thank you, Gloria, for that. I mean, it also works both ways, right? And Americans don't say this enough. I remember my first year as a beginning professor at the University of Minnesota and teaching Gloria's work on the Mati and Mati work. And so Gloria was also one of those models that helped me to imagine doing this kind of work. So absolutely, we also have to make those connections and those routes much more visible, to folks. Else they could just think this was, an insular national project. We're all engaged.
Thank you.
So important, and even beyond the Europe-US nexus. I mean, I know it also was a very meaningful text to feminists in Brazil, for example. Vice versa. Yeah. I want
how not just how these texts traveled, but also how these writers were in collaboration with writers, in Europe, in Asia, in South America, in the Caribbean.
And activists.
Not just in collaboration with writers, but also, other organizations, other activists.
Yeah, and often I think that was fomented by many of the UN organizations working in countries, right? Yeah. I hate to end what has been a really lovely afternoon and conversation I want to thank Maria and FQT and GSWS and Melissa and all of the people who came, faculty, students, staff, colleagues near and far, for this great talk. And I don't know, Maria, are there parting words, next events that you want to hip everybody to? But I just want to say thank you to Erica and Ron for indulging my strange questions sometimes.
Not
and
strange at all.
That's
for your
strange. No, thank you.
Really
Thank
wonderful.
you.
Yeah.
Just wanted to extend my thanks and let folks know that we have our final event in April, so be on the lookout as part of the series, I mean. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.